Nathan Archer,
Todd.
thanks for joining us, mate.
No problem.
Really appreciate your time today. You've had an extensive career in the Australian Defence Force, a senior officer in the Army, logistics supply chain specialist, and now within industry. Not only are we working together, but you're working with other organisations around helping to advise and advance organisations and governments in the region. Supply chain logistics in the current scenario, in our current setting. Mate, talk to me about it.
It's exciting, isn't it? Right? And I know that a lot of my warfighter mates would be excited to hear me talk about this, all right? Because it's the one thing that they truly don't understand, right? But they need a lot of.
But they also, when everyone leaves the Defence Force, they become loggies. Is that
well,
right?
yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
right? And as they become much more senior officers, logistics becomes a far more important issue to them, all right? It becomes recognised. And that's not a slight on them. They do start to understand the importance of it, right? So it's when it really comes to the fore how important it is. But I would also say that it's not the most exciting topic that they want to talk about, right? Things that go bang, are probably more exciting to them, and I can understand that. But for me, the excitement is in what I do and what I did, should I say, for the military, and I loved every minute of it, to be honest. It's always great to know that you're part of the fight. You might not be up the front, but definitely you're part of it. And if you're not doing your job properly, then they can't do theirs.
Yeah. Well, I guess, the two biggest inputs and costs into any military effort is food, fuel,
ammunition is a big one, right?
How do you get them?
Yeah, 135 keeps you alive, right? 9 keeps you going. So they're the class of supply that the military talk about. But the 135 keeps you alive.
Just expand on that a little bit for me.
Yeah, so class of supply, you got your ammunition. 3 is fuel, and 5 food. Right. So you got to have some ammunition, some fuel, and some food.
And what's 9?
9 is repair parts.
Right.
That keeps you going. So there's other supplies in there, and my memory is not as great as it used to be to remember them all. I may have even got 3 and 5 the wrong way around, but it's they're the keys to an armed force, and in today's modern force, right, which is highly mobile, a lot of technology, highly complex systems. You can see that the maintenance and repair is extremely important. The other aspect of importance to that is, and what we can talk about today, is industry. Right, with the more complex systems that are now being put out there by industry for our warfighters to use, it takes a lot of time, a lot of skills, to build up within a workforce to be able to maintain those. The key aspect for Army though is, and in particular Army because that's my background, but you could also probably relate this to Navy and Air Force, is they need to get people out there and operating as quickly as possible. So the training cycles need to be quick enough that they can get people in, train them up, and get them out there so they can operate and support. Right. With that thought, right, is that does the military have time to train its people for 3 to 4 to 5 years to gain the necessary skills and experience to be able to maintain the equipment, or do they give them enough knowledge that they can go out there and do the basic activities on equipment so they can keep it going, but when it starts to get to the more complex issues and repair requirements, failures in the machines, they come back to industry because industry has the time to build that workforce, right? So there is a balance there between how much do we need our warfighters and our maintainers to be able to do on the equipment, between having industry there to support, right? That's a fine balance that I believe that doesn't always match up, all right? But it's not too bad, right?
It's interesting you say that too, because not only, I guess, internally, when I say internally within Australia, but then you look at it, not that we're an expeditionary force any longer, whether we either were at any stage, we've been involved, I guess, in conflicts and training offshore, but we talk about interoperability, interconnectedness, interchangeability across the Indo-Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
How do we operate more effectively with our partners? So Five Eyes partners, Quad partners, AUKUS partners, some of the same. When and we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago with some other guests, with Ray Powell and Paddy Hallinan and Matt Ort, around we can't effectively share information amongst each other. We can't. There's no common governance structures about how we operate. How can we do this better in the Indo-Pacific as a team to get better outcomes for not just the warfighter, but I guess also for the communities in which we serve?
Yeah, look, I listened to that conversation. That was really interesting too, by the way. And I agree with a lot that was said there. It's always going to be the challenge, right? I don't think we'll ever get, we'll never meet this perfect way of being able to operate together. I think that the challenge is always how often can we operate together so that we can build up this knowledge of and build these processes. Like if you look at NATO, for example, with all the different countries that are operating there, the key thing they have is they have a clear and present danger every day. So there's almost a need for them to be able to operate together, and they do a lot of activities together. They're a really great example. I think in the Indo-Pacific region, we don't have that. Even though it's growing, it's still not there. So when you look at how Australia operates compared to how the US operates, compared to how the Indians operate, how the Japanese operate, we don't have that need yet to bring everybody together, operate under a single set of doctrine, a single set of processes and procedures. It's not there. However, the exercises we do together, the work that they do, a lot of maritime activities happen together, especially in the South China Sea. The more they learn about how best to operate, even though they might have different doctrine that they're operating to, they find the commonalities. And I think that's the key right now, is trying to find some commonality in how we operate. I understand the difficulties in exchange of information. That can be challenging, and it really at times has to be, if it's going to be exchanged, it's at some of the most highest levels. It gets exchanged and it doesn't necessarily filter down, right? But it does get filtered down sufficient that decisions can be made. And I have trust that happens. I have to have trust that happens, because that's what we need to have in our defence forces. Trust that they're making the right decisions, trust that they're getting the right information, and what they're doing is the right thing to protect and defend our strategic borders and our national interests. And I think they're doing it. I'm not going to be critical. But there's more that can happen. But right now, I don't think we're there yet with that imperative that's going to drive us down the road of coming together as a collective to sit down and form like a NATO type of organisation where we operate under a single banner with a single set of doctrine that we all align to. I personally don't think we've got that incentive yet, but I think it's coming.
Yeah. Right. And so obviously there's a bit of a difference between integrated logistics systems and supply chain and logistics, but talking about supply chain and logistics, strategic supply chains, a federal government, an Australian government a number of years ago decided it was a good idea to have strategic fuel supplies located in Texas in the US and that we could call on them when we need them. I found that quite a strange decision to be made, obviously for a number of reasons. What are your thoughts on something like that and other decisions as such?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges we have is the tyranny of distance. I think it's the challenge that we've always had is how do we protect those? Well, I would assume that most of this fuel would have to come via sea. It's not going to be flown, so therefore we have our sea lines of communication, as we call them in the military. How do we protect those? At the moment, it's not a challenge for us, right? Getting freedom of movement through the Pacific Ocean, we're not challenged yet, and I say yet. It's not to say, with the rise of certain countries that challenge won't come into the future. So right now the decision is probably okay. If you think about when we mobilise and go into a full-blown conflict, then that decision would be challenged significantly, and we have to have, another plan. There has to be another plan. We can't just put everything on that one, because then that's a single point of failure for us. And I think that the late great Jim Molan was a big advocate for talking about how we build these strategic reserves here in Australia, rather than have them overseas. because of issues such as managing and protecting our lines of communications when conflict does start to occur. So I'm not going to say it's not a great idea now, because clearly it's working. But I'd say that once we get into a conflict where we have a peer force in opposition to us who can challenge in our supply lines of communication, that's going to be a problem for us.
And that's probably the biggest threat, right? Like, not saying anything's going to happen the next little while, hopefully, but it could be said we're already at war with in the cyber domain anyway. But in all honesty, if anyone wants to really affect Australia, it's really around trade. So cutting off shipping lines, communications, so on and so forth. How does it compare now as it did to when you were actively in the army and in your supply chain roles? Were the same sort of threats back then considered as they are now?
Your protection of your lines of communication, as we call them, which are your supply lines, was always a factor that had to be taken into account. It doesn't matter whether you were doing an exercise in Australia, you still had to consider that as part of your logistical plan, as part of your security plan. It has to happen. As you grow up through the military and you start to focus more outside of just what's happening a couple of kilometres away from you, you start to look at the strategic landscape. You start to understand how important some of these what we would call trade channels are. They're not just about moving imports and exports backwards and forwards. They actually have a national strategic importance to us, because if you study geography, you have a look at our northern borders and the countries to the north, and then you look to the east and the west, you can understand that there's a huge amount of coastline, and there's a huge amount of space, and when you're trying to move stuff across through there, we need to be able to move stuff not direct from one place to another over great distance, right, and expose it. We need to be able to move it around to protect ourselves, the asset itself, as well as the stuff it's carrying. So keeping it close enough, and moving it quickly, being able to, I suppose, store it somewhere in the case we need it, which may not necessarily be onshore, it may be offshore, but when we need it, we need to move it quickly. So, there's a lot of challenges in this area. There are only so many routes to take. There's only so many routes, right? And that's the key thing about how do we get stuff in, how do we get stuff out, because it's not about necessarily bringing stuff in to necessarily fight from Australia. It might mean we have to project force. How do we project force? How do we build up that force? There's only certain avenues that we can use, avenues of approach, to use a military term, that we can use to move stuff. So these trade routes are really important, not only for our national economy, but I think from a national security point of view, they're also extremely important, that we be able to control freedom of access, which is the key thing.
And Nathan, you've obviously worked when you're in military. You worked with commercial providers, and since leaving the military, you work with and for commercial providers as well. Can you tell me a little bit about the importance of the interconnectivity of the commercial and the military supply chains?
Yeah, I think that it's critical for the military that they have the ability to rely upon industry to be able to be responsive to what they need. So there doesn't necessarily have to be commonality of systems between the military and the industry in regards to when we talk about like an ERP, for example. We don't have to be using the same ERP. It'd be great, but it's not necessary. But what has to happen is we have to be able to provide supplies using military codification. So we have to do that, right? Because that supports them in being able to identify items quickly and get them into the supply chain and move them through fast. We have to be able to produce sufficient and hold sufficient that in the event that they want to work, they mobilise, that we can provide quickly. The challenge is that in industry is we will have more than one customer, right? So if you're talking military customers, they all want the same. They have varying amounts of the equipment that are being used. They pay varying amounts of dollars to get the priority. So industry has to make money, right? But at the same time, it needs to be able to support its customer base. Now, that causes friction. It causes a lot of friction inside the companies at times. For they can't just go and sink money into having a stockpile that never gets used. So they have to create a balance of, well, how much do we need, and how quickly can we make it if all of a sudden it's needed. That's investment. It's always about money on the industry side. For defence, it's always about the outcome. They need to deliver a capability to government. So there's a cost. They understand that, but that's not their primary focus. Their primary focus is the end state, being able to deliver the capability. So there's a tension. There's always a tension between the defence and what they need, and industry and what is required by industry to be able to meet those levels of agreement that they have. And I've sat in meetings. I've been in plenty of meetings between defence and industry heads, and it's not always friendly tension, right? But it's tension and it's friction. But I think at the base of everything is that industry truly wants to provide what defence needs. They're not there to just take the money. They have a national interest in the outcome. And I've worked for some countries, or worked for some companies, should I say, that are overseas company who is part of the fabric of their defence, right? And they have a national interest, right? They have a personal interest from the people who work for that company in protecting the sovereignty of where they are, right, from a lot of countries who don't want them to be there anymore. So there is a desire to help. There is a desire to deliver. It doesn't always seem like that. Defence might not always see it that way, or we might feel like defence is maybe asking for more than what it should. But everybody wants the same outcome, and that is a safe Australia. We want our borders protected. We want to have freedom in the sense of freedom, right? And create a deterrent. We want our, from a individual company point of view, we want our equipment working and doing what we said it would do, right? Not working at all, and therefore not delivering an outcome or a capability. So the tension's good. I love some of the tension, but in essence, I think everybody's pulling in the same direction.
So in the region, Nathan, there's obviously quite a few large buyers of defence services and products. So the US, number one.
Yep.
China, totally different question, obviously.
Yep.
India,
yes,
very large defence industrial base and growing. Australia, we're not necessarily a big spender on defence.
Nope.
But then, within the Indo-Pac, there's over 40 countries. So smaller countries like Bangladesh, obviously some of the Southwest Pacific and South Pacific nations who don't necessarily have a defence budget or a need for defence. How do we support, and when I say we, I guess the larger countries in the region, how do we support, I guess, growth, so defence industry growth in these regions and these countries that are important to us, to our way of life and to our security, for the region's security as well? How do we support their growth in defence industry and supporting the defence industrial base?
Well, I think, first of all, shout out to Austrade. I hadn't got a lot to do with them when I was in the military, but subsequently have, and there's a lot of people out there, trying to find business. They're trying to support these countries by, going and engaging and seeing where Australia, Australian industry can actually support, to meet their outcomes. And their outcomes aren't necessarily the same as Australia's outcomes. All right, a lot of theirs might just be simply domestic, because they have no external threat. From their perception, I would say there is an external threat they need to be conscious of, but they certainly don't have the budget, right? They certainly don't have the money to spend on some of the stuff that maybe Australia can, maybe India can, maybe Japan can. Definitely China does, right? Singapore is another country in this area which spends money on military, as well as the US. So the Austrade guys are out there finding stuff for us to maybe be able to support. The other one is foreign affairs, and obviously donation of equipment to these countries where we can donate it. Not everything can go. Trying to support that. Then you've got the funding that comes through DFAT to help them with building infrastructure or providing them with some funding for, schools in regards to military schools to help uplift their military skills and so on. There's a lot of stuff going on in the background that probably doesn't even make the news. But I think, the balance is right. I think the key thing here is, though, we've got to make sure that we've got what we need in Australia to protect our national interests. But I think that this is also the contributions that we make to some of these smaller countries is beneficial from a national strategic point of view of, making them know that we're here to help and here to support. Maybe other countries aren't necessarily as transparent as us, right? But we certainly, from an industry point of view, we want to help wherever we can and we want to sell our products. But realistically, some of these countries they just don't have the budget for it, right? And they have to prioritise what they spend their money on. So they're not really looking to build a big army either, or a big navy, or an air force. So they just don't have the billions of dollars. But we can support them in other ways.
Talking of supporting, commercial organisations, they often think, the defence dollar, let's chase the defence, or the government dollar. It's a long runway.
Yes.
It can be up to 10 years. We've obviously put a lot of businesses and local governments through defence-ready programs. What is it that defence specifically, not just the ADF, but other defence organisations in the region, what is it they look for in commercial suppliers?
Oh, it's a broad question, mate. I think in the essence they're looking at what they offer. So the technology, there's really an interest in how can we use this, especially if it's innovative. So they're always looking to have some technological edge over their adversary, whoever that is, right? But they also have the limitations of budget. So where they might like something, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can have it. However, what they're looking at first is I think they're looking at the technology first and foremost to see its applicability. How are we going to use this? How could we use this? Is this something we want to use? And then they might start to broaden out to understand, if we were to bring this in, what does that mean to our personnel? So they look at the fundamental inputs to capability as key areas. I can't list them all for you, right? I knew that question might come up, but there's a number. I think there's 9 of them all up, and industry's one of them now, which is great. But that's how they look at it from a capability point of view. When you get to the point though of going into contract to acquire, there's lots of other aspects that they look at from the company point of view. There's this push to support sovereign companies or sovereign industry, because not all countries with Australia in their name are necessarily sovereign, right? But, the fact that they're employing people in Australia, the fact that they've got facilities and manufacturing in Australia is supporting our economy. So there's sovereign industry. But they'll look at that. They look at risk factors associated with, the company itself. How quickly can we manufacture these things? What's our supply chain look like? They really do take a detailed look at whether or not, if we took this technology, would we be able to use it the way we want to be able to use it, and could you support it in the way in which we need you to support it? And that's they look at risks. So defence really does take a view to risk. Everything they do is about risk, and there's some risks that they will take and some risks that they won't take, and that's just if they're looking at a sole piece of technology from a sole company. If you want to compete in a tender, then really, it's another big effort to try and identify and mitigate the risks for the customer in whatever it is you write about, because it's pretty much writing. But in essence, I think they look at the technology and then they weigh up the risks associated with maybe contracting that company.
So tell me, in your role when you're in green, did you ever have any major issues with suppliers where you had to one, either rake them over the coals or can a contract because they weren't delivering?
There, I wasn't in a role where I was personally responsible. I've seen a number of briefs written over my time for, projects that we're considering being closed for varying reasons, whether that be that they didn't believe the capability was required anymore, whether the cost was just blowing out. Where decisions weren't necessarily made because of the facts. They were made maybe from gut feel sometimes to continue, or sometimes it might have been political. I'm not saying any more than that. But I have been involved in other projects where eventually decisions were taken that this is not what we want. This has become something we don't want anymore, or we're not sure we want what they're offering anymore. We want to go back and have a look at it.
Change in circumstance.
Yeah,
right.
and I think I suppose an organisation like Defence, once you provide an opportunity for the bean counters or for people to say, hey, you don't think this is the right idea now because we've got a number of good ideas waiting in the wings. All right, well, you go away, think about that. We're just going to take your money now and we'll budget and we're going to use it elsewhere because we still have imperatives in other areas which we believe are ready to go. It's a risk, right? A risk you take in defence. But that was back then. I think things have changed somewhat since I sort of left that side.
Yep.
But I've been I don't know if I'm a bad omen, but I've been associated with a lot of programs that eventually have shut down. Which is, I try not to go near projects anymore. I just don't.
It's not you, mate. It's me.
Oh,
is that what
yeah.
you,
I think well, mate, I'm starting to feel like it's me.
It's not you, buddy. Mate, I'd like to move on to the topic a little bit. You've worked offshore a lot in your time. You've had time overseas.
Yeah.
How do you, in an environment as such? I mean, obviously there's procurement guidelines in place and there's agreements in place with certain suppliers, but how do you procure goods when you're offshore? You're working offshore. You need a capability. How do you go about doing that?
Credit card. So we have the ability to buy direct when we're overseas. We do have that capability. We don't necessarily need to go through a formal tender process. But then again, the things that we buy for credit card are not. They're consumable. Yep. In a sense. We're not buying a tank, right? That we don't do that, right? That's done through formal process. But at times, it's the credit card just to get a part. We need a part. The system, we need it now because this capability is needed right now. If there's a local supplier, let's just go buy it, right? We'll buy it. And we'll still keep the demand in the system because that part will probably break again. You can even set up local arrangements with suppliers to provide. So that can happen as well. And, from a hearts and minds point of view, sometimes that's a really great thing to set up, right, is local providers. But not all. You can't always do that in some of the environments that I've been in, right? Setting up local suppliers is just not feasible. So your credit card comes in handy, and it's not your personal credit card I'm talking about, right? It's an approved one used for the government, where only certain people have access to use it, right? But it can be used. And there are conditions around how that's used. But that provides some flexibility. When we're talking about major parts through the proper supply chains, that's a frustration. So your planning really is important when you leave to make sure that you understand what you need and how much of it you're going to need, what's going to break often. Now, that brings up a challenge as we we start to remove some of the older capabilities out of our fleets and bring in the newer capabilities because we don't always have this data. We don't always know what's going to break regularly. So if we go with new kit, we don't always get it right. And that means that we don't always have what we need, and it's going to take time to get it. That's a problem with as we introduce new fleets of equipment into service is we don't know what breaks often. So what are we going to take? Can't take everything because we don't have space. So we have to guess sometimes, and then we hope it's educated. We hope we're right, and if we're not, then we have to hope that the supply chain can be responsive. And when you're maybe 10,000 kilometres away, it's not necessarily as responsive as you like because there's a lot of stuff moving through a very small pipeline.
It's interesting, isn't it? Having worked specifically, I guess, with Navy for over 20 years in supply chain, if a part breaks, you could be in any port in Southwest Pacific. It can take days to get a part through the right channels, back to the ship, get it fitted, off you. But that delays sailing, that delays capability, it delays a whole lot of things in the supply chain. But talking of spare parts, you've got a bit to do with an Australian company called Speed 3D. Now, this solves one part of the problem here with certain parts on certain assets and platforms. But how has that changed? How we procure things and not just the Australian Defence Force again, but across the Indo-Pac, how organisations, militaries procure and also provide spare parts to certain platforms.
Yeah, so this is really great stuff that the two co-founders, Byron and Steve, have done, right? And a really great team of people behind have worked with them. Some have been there from the very beginning too. So this is incredible stuff that they've done. By creating a metal 3D printer, right, that's capable of making parts and components, within an hour, right? Now that's not the full processing capability, but that's a near what we call a near net shape. So it looks and feels like the part you need. There's more work that has to be done to heat treat it, to then machine it, drill it, right, and polish it up. So it's a completed part that can be used. Now, they've this is 10 years. Their anniversary for 10 years, right, was earlier this year. We celebrated 10 years of them being, an organisation. So overnight success, 10-year overnight success, right? But what they're doing is really challenging. It's complementing the supply chain. We're challenging the mindset of people to think that it has to sit on a shelf. It has to be cast, then sit on a shelf to then be called forward by the customer to then be sent forward to wherever it's needed. Which is the key thing is time. What we're saying is that supply chain is still necessary, right? Because we're not going to be, we can't build as much, right, as casting. Casting can build lots over a very short period of time, but it's a costly process and it takes time to get everything in that situation or position that you can start the production. You hit a button, right? All you need's a drawing, a graphic, a CAD drawing, right? And we're using our software, their software, right? It just transforms it into what we call a toolpath. That's for the robot, right? And then you hit go, and it prints. It's that simple. You need to have some design experience, right? But really, he's teaching this stuff to kids at school, right? That's how simple it is, right? Kids at school are designing stuff and doing 3D printing. It's no different. It's just we're using metal powder. We're not using plastics, right? So I printed a part in 26 minutes, right, from a military vehicle, right, an Australian military vehicle, 26 minutes. Now, then it needs to be heat treated for a couple of hours. Then we can mill it, and then it's no different to the parts that they're buying and getting supplied through their suppliers. So if you think about this from an expeditionary point of view, it's being able to move these systems and pre-position them forward so they can supplement. That's
replacing,
groundbreaking,
yeah.
right? So it's not replacing,
yeah.
And that's the key thing. We're not replacing. We're supplementing. We're providing the ability to be able to print at the point you need it, when you need it. Anything within the that fits within the dimensions of what we're talking about. That's critical. You basically design it, you print it, you cook it, you use it.
And it's a fairly small footprint, right? 10, 20-foot container, depending on the unit?
Well, if you look about the expedition, the whole capability, which is the printer and then the post-processing, it's two 20-foot containers.
Wow. So you put them on every aircraft carrier as an example, and even some of the larger vessels that we've got, the Adelaide,
amphibious capability.
And you're really then enhancing and supporting that forward deployed capability, be it ground, air, maritime.
Now, the other interesting aspect of this, right, when you talk maritime, is the way in which they've set up the machine. Because what it is it's blowing the powder out through a rocket, basically. Can't think of the word at the moment, but rocket nozzle, right? That rocket nozzle stationary, the arm of the robot moves around that to basically develop the path. So from a maritime point of view, where you're pitching and rolling, it doesn't matter, right? The robot arm's only interested where the rocket nozzle is, not anything else. So from a pitch and roll point of view, and we've proven this with the US Navy, right, that you can print on board a ship. So it doesn't matter.
So it's a really good example of Australian innovation, Australian technology supporting the region. So you mentioned that the US Navy are using it, trialling it?
US Navy have been trialling it, yep. They've done a couple of different things. We're doing some trials now in Hawaii with US Navy. Good friend of the podcast, Matt Ort, is out there, been out there doing this thing, getting a suntan, right? We've got it now in Japan. Japan are using it. The UK just trialled it on a NATO exercise successfully. Now, the beauty about that was they got some training from us and then they just deployed it.
Great.
And they did it themselves and they've been manufacturing parts. The key thing here is a lot of obsolete equipment in every military around the world, right? And the suppliers, moving on like they should to the more more interesting stuff. They're not necessarily seeing too much rotation of parts, so therefore they move on to other customers, other clients. So being able to get some parts and components for some of this aging equipment is hard, right? This is the stuff that's still needed though, and this capability, this printer, can make those parts and components. You just design it, print it, put it into a graphic within CAD, whether you're using a SolidWorks or a Fusion 360. Not promoting any companies here, but they're generally the ones that you use.
Just got to hit them up for advertising. Yeah. Let's make a note.
And away you go. You convert it into our software. Our software converts it into a toolpath. You choose your material, whether that be copper alley, bronze alley, and stainless steel, and you put the powder in and hit print.
So an organisation, as an example, where you think, okay, they've either got ageing or obsolete equipment, they're trying to manufacture their own, they've got an indigenous sovereign capability that's emerging. But the Indian Defence Force, as an example, they've got a lot of Russian equipment, which they're trying to phase out for a number of reasons. One, I guess a lot of it was from the USSR era, where, and the way the USSR worked was every state made one little component to build something. That's gone. So is an organisation like the Indian Defence Force
a perfect one, right? Perfect one to consider within the Indo-Pac region as being a country that would probably make great use of this kit to be able to keep their fleets running, because we're seeing it now in Ukraine, right? Which is a country we've got machines in now, and they are using them, right? They got a lot of equipment from a range of different countries that they're having to support. So, having the ability to be able to make parts for equipment where they've had donations, a lot of donations, is critical. So we know it works. We know the technology works. It's proven. It's at a tech readiness level 9. It's on operations. So somewhere like India would be ideal. They have a large landmass, right? So being able to move stuff around in India clearly is a challenge. So to be able to put these sort of machines in strategic locations around India so that they have greater access, so reducing that line of communication between the users and the supplier, right? You can put them as far forward as you want. They're 2 20-foot containers. Put them on the back of wheels, and you can leave them on the back of wheels. You can drive them around. It can print. I reckon it prints while you're driving. All right?
Wow.
So you can run a print and move it from one place to another and get there and just stop, and then you're doing it. What it can do is still being learned. What we know the technology can do is make a part out of metal, and an effective part out of metal. It's faster than casting.
Quickly.
right? And, you know, it can give you what you need. Some challenges there in regards to, you know, IP. You know, there's a challenge there that we just need to make sure we understand what the rules and requirements are. But take the Repco model, for example. You know, how many parts are made by Repco, yet they fit on, you know, all the different car models, right? Or, you know, so I think that there's maybe a misconception that everything has got a patent on it. It doesn't. Not every part has a patent. There's not a license on every part, you know, which is how Repco survive, right? And I use them as an example.
Good example.
Right? But any other company that makes spare parts for multiple, you know, vehicles, right? Generic parts, right? So this is all it's really doing is it's just making a part because it's needed there and then because the supply chain can't get it to them fast enough. So we want to make stuff quickly, get it back into the fight quickly.
Yeah. And that negates your demand forecasting. Now, one of the biggest challenges, as you mentioned at the beginning of our chat, was you don't know what's going to break and when and where.
Yeah.
And demand forecasting is very difficult when it comes to especially moving parts in those environments. Just-in-time stock, just-in-case stock, balancing all of these things. And again, I guess the Speed 3D example is a really good example of that innovation and technology. Somewhere like India as well, very different environments. They're in conflict on all borders as well. You've got the Himalayas, which is a cold environment, a hilly environment. Then obviously you've got their challenges around some of their maritime borders as well, and they're obviously a forward deployed force as well these days as well. So something like that as an example. By the way, I've got to hit Speed 3D up for advertising as well.
Yep,
but an example of something like that can really revolutionise supply chains.
Absolutely, and this is what we're trying to educate people on now because it's, everybody's focused on, you know, the printing piece, but it's what we can do to support the supply chain, which is now what we're talking about, is we complement the supply chain. We want you to understand that you put this in your supply chain, you're assuring it.
Yeah.
You're providing a level of assurance, right? Because you can move this around to where you need it. Whereas it's very difficult to move the warehouse. It's very difficult to move the port, right? That where the ship is going to be, or the airport. It's
or
hard.
in times of conflict, like I mentioned earlier, it could be hard to get parts to where they're required if there's issues between A and B.
Exactly. And I think that, you know, on top of what we're doing in this space, there are other companies out there that are also looking at how can we support assuring supply chains, you know, whether that's through providing autonomous systems into the field, whether it's robotic systems into the field. You know, industry is looking at this future problem, as well as defence, to find these innovative solutions to support how defence knows it's going to be fighting into the future. So we know that making parts as far forward as you can is really important. That is paramount to being able to stay in the fight, really.
But one of the other challenges I've seen from a commercial logistics point of view, having supported many defence forces around the region with supply chain logistics, is it's not only having the part or the item. You might have it in stock in your warehouse in Sydney, and you've got to send it to, let's just say, let's say Afghanistan back in the day. Not only have you got the issue of sending it, but then you've got customs clearance issues. You've got duties. You've got taxes. You've got, hang on, that's getting held up because someone hasn't paid the right person, even though you shouldn't, even though you don't, you know, that's not how we operate. It's like, hang on a minute, this is a real problem. So something like a Speed 3D, again, not, it's not just Speed 3D we're talking about here, but something like that can solve all those problems because you manufacture it in country.
Yeah,
wow.
and just put it on the back of a truck.
Wow.
Right. And send it with the rest of your kit, and you've got a manufacturing capability right there and there.
Wow.
When you need it, where you need it.
Solving a lot of supply chain issues.
Huge amount.
Tell me, have you seen anything similar with other, inputs into supply chain? So innovative technology as such. So obviously they're a metal printer that make parts. Anything else you've seen in your time, like working in industry, especially over the last 10 years or so, where you've seen innovation as such, or emerging innovation to support supply chain technology?
I did see, it's not necessarily supporting supply chain, but it can, is from the autonomy point of view, being able to have logistic vehicles moving in and around the battle space, carrying necessary supplies to whomever needs them. I mean autonomously. I don't mean robotic. I don't mean leader-follower. I mean a capability which means that task the vehicle with a mission, and it then works using AI, right? It works out where it needs to go, when it needs to go. It even takes in inputs from other areas. So when you've got a demand system, like they use, if they're using an electronic demand system, it can even reprioritise and say, well, I know you needed this, but I've just picked up information from a different call sign that says it needs it more than you right now. So I'm going over there, then retask other assets, autonomous assets in the battle space to then fulfill that demand. Now, that blew my mind when I saw that stuff. Right?
Is this Australian technology?
No.
No. Okay. Gotcha. Picking up what you're putting down. That's really interesting because, like you said, if it's not leader-follower, so no human interaction to start with at all. So you're reducing time, space, potential for human casualty as well, decision-making.
Yep.
And then the data you're gathering. What do you do with that data?
Well, I mean, the data goes back into the system, even to the point of the devices, or I call them devices, but they're systems, are able to identify the type of, so look at the map, identify probably the most likely soil type and whether or not it has the ability to traverse across there, and then decide on a different route, right? It can even take into account where there's activities occurring based on inputs from battle management systems to determine that that's actually not a safe route anymore. I have to take this route, So it is mind-blowing what's going on right now. Now, that if you can have that sort of responsiveness in a logistic capability, right, that's out there running around the battle space, and it's not uncontrolled. There are humans still in the loop to be able to retask, but you're allowing the system to make decisions, right? All you got to do is just keep that platform stocked. So if we just take those UAVs that come back to the nest to recharge, right? It's saying, you need more power. Well, it includes, these vehicles are even including, we don't have enough of anything anymore to be able to provide sufficient support. We're coming back to base to fill up, and then another vehicle will go and then take over to continue providing that support. Ongoing, it provides protection because no longer requires a human to drive the vehicle, so we don't have humans forward. We're protecting our forces. We're sustaining our forces faster. We're more responsive, right? It's changing. You talk robot wars. This is the first thing that came into my head. So that sort of technology, which is probably still a little, it's out there.
Well, you think about the autonomy around vehicles, be they UAVs, underwater vehicles, but even road vehicles. I'm just thinking back to with some far smarter people that I was in the room with doing a lot of planning for the MEAO withdrawal out of Afghanistan, and the various routes that you could or couldn't take. I mean, you know what they're all about. Yep. And that was actually, you get one thing wrong and it's catastrophe. It's disastrous for people. Right? You can replace things. It's the people. Yep. Wow, that's revolutionary.
Yeah, it is. And
that's revolutionary.
One of the easy targets out there in the battle space is logistics.
Yep.
Right. It's an easy target, and it's also a critical target.
Yeah, and logisticians because we're all good looking and handsome.
That's exactly right.
Mate, I hate to do this. We've got to wrap it up.
So good.
But I really want to thank you for your time. This is going to be the one in very many conversations. We could chat for hours and hours. I think your insights today have just been phenomenal, and I think it gives hopefully the listener and the watcher some insights into the art of the possible around supply chain and logistics in the military sphere.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me along, mate.